All right, so let's jump into this. You brought something to our attention that's, well, frankly, pretty surprising. It seems like, you've got this field, behavior analysis. It's all about data, right? Really careful data collection. And they use visuals all the time, especially line graphs, to show what they found. But get this, a huge review of over 4,300 of these graphs found that, and I'm quoting here, a high degree of deviation from standards of graph construction and proper labeling. Kind of makes you scratch your head, doesn't it? Like, how can a field so focused on data have so much trouble with, like, well, presenting the data?
It is interesting, isn't it? Because the thing about behavior analysis is that line graphs aren't just some like optional extra. They're core to how the field works.
Yeah.
Like if you want to show that a treatment or intervention had a real effect,
Yeah.
how big that change was, whether it stuck around the line graph, that's how you do it. So if those graphs are, well, let's just say less than perfect, it raises some serious questions about whether folks in the field are really communicating clearly and accurately.
Yeah, I mean, spot on. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. You, our learner, you're the one who flagged this study for us, a 2017 paper from Educational Psychology Review. It's like peeking behind the curtain and finding out that something you thought was simple, something as basic as a line graph, might actually be a lot more complicated than it seems.
Right. And let's be clear. It's not like other areas of psychology haven't had their issues with graphing in the past, but this study zeroed in specifically on behavior analysis because, as we said, those visuals are just so fundamental to the work they do. So our mission here, it's twofold. First, we got to understand just how widespread these inconsistencies really are. But then, and this is the big one, we've got to figure out what that means for how we make sense of behavioral data. Like, if the graphs aren't right, can we even trust the conclusions?
Right. And they didn't mess around with this review. We're not talking about a handful of examples here. They dug into 313 graphs from 11 different journals in the field. That's a mountain of data. So for you listening, our learner, we're going to break down the key findings, show you where these graphs tend to go wrong, and most importantly, explain why those mistakes actually matter when it comes to understanding behavior. Get ready for some aha moments.
Yeah, buckle up. So first things first. Let's look at the basic structure of the graphs themselves. Now, on the plus side, most of them, like 98% for the vertical axis and 97% for the horizontal axis, they actually had those axes drawn. So at least the framework was usually
Okay,
there.
so the lines are there. But that's not the whole story, right? It's not just about drawing lines. It's about what those lines represent. It's about the labels. And that, I think, is where things get really interesting.
You got it. So they looked at those vertical axis labels,
Yeah.
the ones that tell you what's being measured. Most of them did fall into the expected categories,
Yeah.
things like percentage, count, ratio, frequency, rate, the usual suspects. But here's the thing. A significant chunk, like 17% of them, had no label at all, just a blank axis. It's like, what are we even looking at here?
Right, like a map with no key. How are you supposed to know what anything means? And it gets even more wonky when you look at the horizontal axis, the one that's supposed to show you how things change over time.
Yeah, that's where things really go off the rails. The most common labels they found were, and I'm not kidding, no label, a whopping 1,486 times, and then sessions or trials, which popped up 1,469 times. So together, those two categories make up almost 70% of all the horizontal axis labels.
Wow, almost 70% either blank or using sessions trials. I mean, what's the big deal with that?
Well, this is where we get into some deep stuff about representing data over time. See, when you're using a line graph to show how behavior changes, especially during an intervention, you're essentially dealing with what's called a time series graph. And one of the cardinal rules of a time series graph is that the horizontal axis has to represent a real, standardized unit of time. Like we're talking seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, you name it. Something everyone agrees on how long it is.
Okay, makes sense. So using sessions or trials, that's not cutting it because, well, what even is a session? It could be 5 minutes, could be an hour. Who knows?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Session or trial, they're not like a minute or a day.
Yeah.
They don't have that same universally understood length.
Yeah.
And that actually leads to three major problems that the researchers identified.
All right, lay 'em on me. What are the three big issues with the session problem?
So, problem number one, session or trial. It's not a unit of time in the same way that, a minute or an hour is. It's just not standardized. One study session could be completely different from another's. And that brings us to problem number two. When you use sessions, you can create this false sense of equality on the graph.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's like saying you walked 2 stretches today. One stretch might have been a quick jaunt to the mailbox, the other a 5-mile hike. Just saying 2 stretches doesn't really tell you anything about how long you were actually walking.
Perfect analogy. And it's the same with these graphs. If you've got sessions of wildly different lengths, but you're plotting them as if they're equal chunks of time, well, you're going to end up with a distorted picture of how behavior is actually changing.
So you might think a change is happening really quickly, but in reality, it's actually happening over a much longer period. It's misleading.
Absolutely. And that leads us to problem number 3. Using sessions can create what's called a non-representative depiction of the data. What that means is it can compress or stretch out the real timeline of the study. Like, you could have 80 days of data squished down into 20 sessions on the graph.
Yikes. So like if a researcher only worked with their client once a week, a month of progress might look the same on the graph as a whole year?
Exactly. The visual representation just doesn't match up with the actual passage of time. And there's a fantastic example of this in the study in Figure 4. They show you a graph that compresses 80 days of data into just 20 sessions. Then, they show you the same data plotted correctly over those 80 days, and guess what? The 2 graphs tell totally different stories about how consistent the intervention was and whether it was actually working over time.
So using sessions is basically hiding crucial details. Like you might miss that the intervention was actually applied inconsistently, or you might think progress stalled when really it was just happening slowly over a longer period.
Exactly. And the researchers, they actually dug into why this sessions problem is so widespread. They suggest it might be because of how graphing is taught. Maybe some textbooks aren't emphasizing time units enough. Or it could be that researchers see everyone else doing it and figure, well, if everyone's doing it, it must be okay. They call that relativism. They also talk about something called substitution, where researchers are actually measuring behavior over time, but then for some reason label their graph with sessions instead.
It's like they're measuring with a yardstick, but then labeling everything in arm lengths. It just doesn't make sense.
Right. So we got these fundamental problems with the structure and labeling of the graphs. But then on top of that, the review also looked at let's say, the quality of the visuals, those little details that can make or break a graph. And sadly, this is where things get even worse.
Oh, boy. So what kind of quality issues are we talking about here?
Well, things like tick marks. Those little lines on the axis and the scaling of the axis. Especially on that horizontal axis, the error rates just skyrocketed. On the vertical axis, they looked at 5 specific features related to tick marks and scaling, and the average error rate was about 22%. Most of the time, the problem was that the tick marks weren't placed properly. Like they weren't fully or even partially outside the graph.
Okay, I'll admit that sounds kind of nitpicky. Like, does it really matter if the tick marks are a little off?
Well, it might seem minor, but it actually makes it harder to accurately line up the data points with the values on the axis. It just adds a layer of imprecision to the whole thing. And remember, we're talking about data that's supposed to be really precise to show the exact effects of these interventions.
Fair enough. And what about the horizontal axis? You said that was even worse.
Oh, yeah. The average error rate there was a whopping 44% across those same 5 features. Same problems with tick mark placement. But they also found tons of graphs where the data points didn't actually line up with the tick marks, and some where the scaling itself was just wrong. Like the numbers on the axis didn't actually correspond to the data being shown.
Wow. I mean, if the very framework of the graph is unreliable, how can anyone be sure they're interpreting the data correctly? It's a recipe for confusion.
It really is. Now, it wasn't all bad news. When it came to things like data points and paths, they found those were mostly clear and visible. About 86% of the graphs got that right. And almost all of them, like 99%, included figure captions, which is great because captions give you context, right? They tell you what the graph is actually about.
Okay, that's good. At least the data itself is usually presented clearly and there's some explanation of what we're looking at. But I'm guessing there were still some issues even in those areas.
Right, you are. They found that about 18% of the graphs that used what are called condition change lines, those vertical lines that show when a new phase of the study starts, like when an intervention is introduced, they didn't label those lines. So you're left wondering what exactly changed. And get this, 7% of the graphs actually connected the data points across those condition change lines, which is a big no-no.
Why is that a no-no?
Because those condition change lines, they're meant to visually separate different phases of the study. Connecting the data points across those lines makes it look like the data is continuous, when in reality there's been a shift in the conditions. It can really muddy the waters, especially when you're trying to figure out the specific effects of the intervention.
It's like trying to figure out if new fertilizer is helping your plants grow, but someone's gone and drawn a continuous line on the growth chart even though you switched fertilizers halfway through. You can't tell what's causing the growth.
Precisely. But Perhaps the most glaring quality issues, the ones that can really skew how we interpret the data, have to do with the axes themselves, specifically how they're proportioned and how they're compared across different graphs.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the deal with axis proportions and comparisons?
So they looked at something called the proportional construction ratio. It's basically the relationship between the length of the vertical axis, the length of the horizontal axis. There are these established guidelines, and they're not just made up. They're based on how our brains perceive visual information that say this ratio should be somewhere between 5.8 and 3.4.
Hold on, why does that ratio matter? What difference does it make how long the axes are?
Well, think about it. If you make the vertical axis really, really long compared to the horizontal axis, any changes in the data are going to look super dramatic.
Right.
Like a tiny increase will look like a huge jump. But if you do the opposite, if you make the horizontal axis super long and squish the vertical axis down, any changes are going to look really flat and insignificant.
Ah, so you can basically manipulate how people perceive the data just by tweaking the axis lengths. That's sneaky.
It is. And that's why those guidelines for the ratio exist, to prevent those kinds of distortions. And remember, that figure 1 in the study, it showed how the exact same data could look totally different depending on the axis ratio. They showed one version where the data looked super variable all over the place, and then another version where it looked really smooth and consistent, all because they changed the axis lengths.
That's wild. And how many graphs actually followed those guidelines for the ratio?
Brace yourself, only about 15% of them. That means a whopping 85% of the graphs they looked at could have been presenting a distorted view of the data, just because of how the axes were proportioned.
85%, that's huge. It's like flipping a coin and having an 85% chance of getting a misleading graph. It's really concerning.
It is. Now, there's one more thing they looked at in terms of comparisons. They wanted to see how graphs were presented when there were multiple graphs in the same article, especially if those graphs were supposed to be compared to each other. They found that, thankfully, the alignment of the graphs on the page was usually pretty good, around 79% for both vertical and horizontal axes. So at least you weren't getting lost trying to figure out which graph went with which.
All right, that's something. So spatially, things were mostly organized well. But what about the axes themselves? Were they consistent across the graphs?
Sadly, no. That's where they found more problems. When it came to maintaining similar scaling between graphs that were supposed to be showing related data, they found an error rate of around 69% for both axes. And when it came to making sure the axes were the same physical length across the graphs, the error rate ranged from 40% to 60%.
Okay, hold on. Why does that matter? Why do the scales and lengths have to be the same?
Because if you're trying to compare, say, the effects of two different interventions, and one graph has a scale that goes from 0 to 100, while the other goes from 0 to 50, it's going to be really hard to visually compare the magnitude of those effects. And if the axes are different lengths, it's going to further distort the visual impression of the data.
It's like trying to compare the heights of two people, but you're using a ruler that's marked in inches for one person and centimeters for the other. You can't get a clear sense of the relative difference.
Exactly. You lose that immediate visual sense of this one is bigger or this one is smaller or these two are about the same. The comparisons become much more difficult, much less intuitive.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, lots of issues with these graphs, but what's the big takeaway? What's the overall significance of all this?
Well, the authors really hammered home this point. Graphs and behavior analysis are not just pretty pictures. They're essential tools for understanding the data and figuring out if an intervention actually works. And if those graphs are poorly constructed, it directly undermines our ability to accurately interpret and communicate those findings.
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. The whole thing is shaky.
Exactly. And that high error rate they found, especially that 85% of graphs not meeting the guidelines for the axis ratio, it's really worrying when you compare it to other scientific fields. It makes you wonder if maybe behavior analysis as a whole needs to do a better job of setting and enforcing clear graphing standards.
Like maybe there needs to be more emphasis on teaching proper graphing techniques. Maybe the textbooks need to be clearer. Maybe the journals that publish this research need to have stricter guidelines for what they'll accept.
Right. If the gatekeepers of the field aren't holding researchers to a high standard, these problems are just going to keep cropping up. So for you, our learner, the big takeaway here is this. Even in a field that's all about data, like behavior analysis, something as seemingly simple as a line graph can be fraught with problems. And these aren't just little nitpicky details. We're talking about fundamental issues with labeling, like using sessions instead of real-time units, and inconsistencies in those quality features we talked about, like axis proportions and scaling. All of these things can seriously distort how we understand behavioral data, and that has real-world implications for how we develop and apply interventions.
It's not just about the data itself, it's about how that data is presented and interpreted. And you, with your passion for learning and understanding, you can now appreciate why those seemingly technical details really matter. Proper data visualization isn't just about making things look nice, it's about making sure scientific findings are communicated accurately and effectively.
So here's something to ponder. Given how common these graphing errors are, how many important insights might have been missed or misinterpreted over the years in behavior analysis? And what happens when this research is applied in real-world settings? Are interventions being designed and implemented based on flawed visual evidence?
It's a sobering thought. We're not saying all the research is wrong, but it does make you take a closer look, doesn't it? So, our learner, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for both the power and the potential pitfalls of visual data. We encourage you to be more critical when you see graphs, even those that seem simple at first glance.
Absolutely. And hey, maybe you'll even be inspired to dig into those graphing standards outlined in the original article, see if you can spot any of these errors in the wild.
It makes you wonder, what other seemingly straightforward tools do we use that might actually have these hidden complexities? What other things are we misinterpreting simply because the way the information is presented is flawed? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Let us know what you think.